In the shadow of escalating conflict around the globe, human lives hang in the balance, caught between the roar of warplanes and calls for peace. In Gaza, tragedy struck again when an Israeli airstrike hit Nasser hospital, taking the lives of 20 people, including 5 journalists, and igniting waves of grief and global outrage, exposing a grim reality of relentless aggression and suffering endured by civilians. The world watches as protests rise in Israel, with citizens demanding an immediate ceasefire to end the bloodshed. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, tensions simmer as US President Donald Trump voices frustration over the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, while still holding on to hope for a breakthrough in peace talks. How do these intertwined crises shape our understanding of conflict, humanity, and the fragile pursuit of peace? Can the world still find a path to peace amid the recurring cycles of violence and deep-rooted political tensions? Welcome to In Focus. The World Health Organization and UN agencies have condemned the deadly Israeli airstrikes on Nasser Hospital in Gaza, which killed 20 people, including medical staff and 5 journalists, according to the UN News. The hospital's emergency and surgical units were severely damaged, further crippling Gaza's already limited healthcare system amid ongoing famine and displacement. Over 61,000 deaths have been reported, with malnutrition-related fatalities rising as the famine spreads. UN officials called for an immediate ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian access, and protection for journalists and health workers. Meanwhile, delays and denials continue, obstructing aid delivery in Gaza. Education remains disrupted, with attacks on shelters housing displaced children. UN leaders urge political will and compassion to end the man-made suffering and secure a lasting ceasefire for the beleaguered enclave. To help us unpack the implications of the devastating airstrikes on Nasser Hospital and the rising calls for a ceasefire in Israel, we're joined by Murad Harfoush, a political analyst from Ramallah. Welcome, sir, to In Focus. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Harfoush, let's start off by asking, now, President Trump expressed displeasure over the Israeli strikes on Nasser Hospital that killed 20 people, including the journalists and medical staff. How significant is this statement coming from him, given that there was also contradictory statements previously that were very pro-Israeli?
The Israeli occupation targets journalists. They have been doing so over the past time period. Lots of them were martyred. We have lots of journalists who were martyred in Gaza. Also the medical staff, ambulance workers, they were targeted by the Israeli occupation forces. The statement issued by Donald Trump within the context of the Israeli airstrike and aggression against the Gaza Strip the statement by Trump doesn't amount to the monstrosity committed against the medical staff and the journalists who were martyred. This is not the first time that journalists are targeted and sniped by Israelis since they started their military operation against Gaza. They have been targeting journalists for some time now, and Trump's statement is like a shy reaction, as well as the international community's stance on the matter. Unfortunately, media workers have been targeted by the Israeli occupation forces intentionally, and the Israeli army is committing a genocide and an ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians in Gaza.
I mean, this kind of brings on the next point here. Now, as you said, it comes short to what the Palestinians in Gaza need to end this aggression. Now, Trump emphasized the need to end this, quote, nightmare, as he said, but also, in the same time, during the same statement, he reiterated Israel's military objectives in Gaza, including the fight for Gaza City, is important for, quote unquote, winning the war, I guess. How do you interpret these mixed signals coming in from President Trump?
This stance that he gave the Israeli occupation forces 2 or 3 weeks, and the Israeli cabinet, he gave them a deadline of 2 or 3 weeks. They will force migrate more than 1 million Palestinians from this city. They will be scattered throughout the Gaza Strip. Also, they have used the starvation weapon, the planned starvation. The Gaza city is imposed to planned starvation. The situation on the ground is devastating. So the United States and the other states, the international community, is liable to stop this genocide, which has been going for 23 months per now. We are exposed to genocide and ethnic cleansing. It has been documented in picture and in video. They have been killing innocent, harmless, unarmed people in Gaza. This war led to the destruction of 90% of the infrastructure in Gaza, and I think that giving the Israeli occupation forces a deadline to conclude the military operation.
Yes, this deadline has already been crossed several times. The Trump administration has given the Israelis deadlines several times. Now, you spoke a bit about accountability here. There have been calls for Israel to be held accountable, including arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court and genocide cases in the International Court of Justice. In your opinion, what is preventing the decisive international enforcement of international law, and how does Trump's stance influence global accountability efforts, given that, like you've said, we're seeing this live on TV, in sound and picture?
I think that what prevents the implementation of arrest warrants against Netanyahu and other Israeli officials who committed war crimes, as these arrest warrants were issued by courts like the ICJ, for example. They committed atrocities and war crimes. They were not arrested. You see that Netanyahu traveled out of Israel. He was not apprehended. Despite committing war crimes and monstrosities, the United States of America prevents the apprehension of Netanyahu. The United States is the Israel is the protege of the United States. Also, the United States is the one preventing the European states to impose sanctions on Israel or to implement the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and other members of the cabinet.
Okay, well, your point has been clear there. That was Murad Harfoush, a political analyst. Thank you so much for your insights and thank you for joining us. While Gaza continues to endure fresh wounds of conflict, tensions in Eastern Europe persist with equal complexity and urgency. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine remains unresolved, with recent statements from US President Donald Trump expressing both frustration and optimism about the path to peace. Let's shift our focus from the Middle East to the geopolitical battleground of Eastern Europe, where the quest for a ceasefire faces its own unique hurdles and hopes. The European Union is preparing its 19th round of sanctions against Russia, targeting entities that help Russia circumvent previous sanctions, especially its shadow fleet of vessels. Politico stated that, however, this new package is expected to avoid major new restrictions on Russia's energy exports, having already committed to phasing out oil and gas imports. European diplomats concede that Washington, not Brussels, is seen as the best position to apply pressure on Russia's war economy going forward. The EU's approach reflects a growing awareness that its current sanctions arsenal has limited impact on Russia's ability to sustain its war in Ukraine. Thus, it increasingly looks to US diplomacy and leadership, including efforts by Donald Trump for breakthrough progress. Joining us now is Justin Thomas Russell, a Global Foreign Policy Center Executive Director from Washington. Thank you for joining us there.
Thank you, Ram.
Let's start off by asking, how likely is it that the proposed bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky will take place, given the current geopolitical climate?
It's hard to say, quite frankly. Vladimir Putin isn't showing any sort of signs that he even wants to engage in bilateral talks with Zelensky. I think that Putin doesn't see Zelensky as an equal. That's a concern. The situation continues to escalate. There's been good faith efforts brought forward by Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership. Donald Trump has done everything except weigh the farm to try and get them to the table. And there doesn't seem to be any movement from Moscow on this. So go ahead.
So you think that basically an expectation of a one-on-one meeting between Putin and Zelensky is most likely not something that's realistic? It's not going to happen.
It has to be realistic if we're looking for long-term peace. Ron, but if we're looking for what the current state is, it just doesn't seem that there's going to be any movement towards peace talks between Zelensky and Putin. No matter what pressure comes, Donald Trump was the best line of defense to put pressure on Putin, and Putin played it like the masterful spy master that he is. So it's going to be a very hard go at it. It's going to be a matter of, can Putin sustain more losses? You're talking about 1 million young men that have lost their lives in this war at the hands of Ukrainians defending their country. How much longer can Putin survive?
But they've been able to absorb, losses, whether it be economically or physically, when it comes to these young men dying, for a few years now, and it has worked for them.
No, that's a very good point, Ram. And here's the issue. The issue is that, at first sanctions, we everybody thought sanctions were going to work. It hasn't. All it's is used its energy resources to build up this wartime economy, and it hasn't had the desired effect that everybody thought it would. Has it had a little effect? Sure. But the reality is the rest of the world, in particular, NATO, the EU, the United States, and our Western allies need to be absolutely in lockstep, making sure that the pressure is put on universally, wholeheartedly, and effectively against Russia. The only way this is going to affect Putin is if it affects his pocketbook. And until that happens, which it doesn't look like it has happened, there's no need for him to sit down at the table. We're seeing some of the most violent and dramatic attacks on Ukrainian soil, particularly in the eastern provinces, that we've seen since the war began. And that is just basically Vladimir Putin thumping his chest, saying how big he is, and he's got control of the situation.
Well, I mean, it kind of looks like he does have control of the situation, but then again, could backdoor or indirect negotiations work for them? I mean, how effective can Trump's direct engagement with Putin be when it comes to influencing the course of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
That's a very good question, and the way that we're analyzing it here at the Global Foreign Policy Center is that one of the great ways is to utilize the alliances that we have that tie into Russia. Here's an example. When we look at the BRICS alliance is becoming a very strong economic power and a very strong alliance, and it's an alliance that Vladimir Putin has a lot of faith in. We had an opportunity to use President Modi in India as a possible envoy to bringing them to the table, and that doesn't seem to work. And quite frankly, there's no financial reason for India to work with Russia to get them to the table. We're talking about putting secondary sanctions because India, China, and some Eastern European countries, including some of our biggest NATO partners, are still buying energy from Russia through loopholes. So, again, we've got to be really, really strategic on how we put in these sanctions. How are we going to be able to stop the economy funding this war effort into Ukraine? And that's something that nobody has an answer to. Nobody's, at least in the West, has been able to find that answer, because every time we think we do, Putin puts on another assault on the Ukrainian people in Ukrainian territory.
When we discuss the idea of U.S. security guarantees, how might these guarantees help the Ukrainians, or for Ukraine to be structured? And what role do the European allies play when it comes to these security guarantees? Are there expectations from the U.S., for instance, when it comes to European allies?
Well, yeah, there's always going to be an expectation from the U.S. when it comes to our NATO allies. In what we're talking about is basically a Article 5 type situation that exists in NATO. That article in the NATO charter that says an attack on one is an attack on all, and we will defend all. We're basically talking about security guarantees for Ukraine, similar to them being in NATO, but not actually being a chartered NATO signatory state to the alliance. That is probably going to be the best guarantee for security. And look, we've seen other countries in the region. One of the biggest advocates for putting pressure on Russia during the Zelensky meeting in Washington last week was the president of Finland. They reluctantly joined NATO, but they saw the threat, as was pointed out by the Finnish president, when he said, look, we've got an entire boundary. We have an entire border with Russia. What is to stop them from coming in and doing the same thing that they're trying to do in Ukraine to Finland? They've claimed Finnish territory before. So that's a big concern. So how do we do this and protect it? There's going to be a responsibility put. It's going to be through spending, through arms trade and arms support, and financial support to the Ukrainian military to make sure that they can withstand further juggernauts put on by Moscow.
Yeah. Well, now, President Trump has given a 2-week deadline. How significant is the potential actions against Russia? And what might those actions entail? I mean, we've seen deadlines come and go when it comes to Russia, and not much has changed.
You said it perfectly. We've seen deadlines come and go. The deadlines mean nothing to Putin. He knows this. Every time we see a deadline being put out by Washington, there's really nothing to back it up. There's two problems with this. One, Putin has the ability to go, "What are you going to do?" and keeps doing what he's doing. The other problem is it takes away U.S. credibility, and that is a big problem.
So do you think this time around it's going to be different?
It's unknown. It's the great mystery in foreign policy that we're dealing with right now, quite frankly. Yes, could it be different? Yes. If we were to come up with a deadline, stick to that deadline, and then all of a sudden promote the idea that the U.S. and NATO is going to go in full force and back up Ukraine. Nobody wants to do that because everybody's afraid of escalation, but at some point, something has to give, or else Putin continues to control the narrative and the situation. That's more dangerous.
But wouldn't that be more dangerous, though? I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, having the full force of NATO enter Ukraine is not exactly the way for peace, is it? It's probably going to escalate things.
But here's the infinite circle that we get in. It's a cart and horse situation. If we don't do that, and Russia continues its aggression and takes down Ukraine and absorbs the Ukrainian territory, where does it stop? We've basically emboldened. If there's nobody to stand up to Putin, where does it stop? Where do we stop rewarding bad actors? From the standpoint of, if NATO does go in, look, if we put in security guarantees, such as the ones that were talked about in Washington with our EU partners and the Secretary General at NATO, if we put in those security guarantees, an attack on one is an attack on all, an attack on Ukraine will bring the full force of NATO behind it, well, then what's the difference? So, we're either going to do it now or we're going to have to do it later. But the question is, if we wait long enough, at what damage to Ukrainian sovereignty, the Ukrainian people, and quite frankly, what kind of a threat does this pose to our Eastern European allies?
Okay, other than, the military option here, let's talk about, economic sanctions. What are the limitations when it comes to the EU sanctions arsenal? And why is the EU increasingly relying more on the U.S. leadership for these sanctions or diplomacy?
Well, when you talk about U.S. and sanctions, it's largely understood or largely thought that the largest economy on the globe is going to have the most ability to, or the best ability to kind of throw its economic weight around enough to get people to take notice of that and follow our lead on certain things, such as the idea that maybe everybody would have followed our lead on sanctions in Russia. Our sanctions and the EU sanctions and our allied nations respecting those sanctions would slowly choke Russian economy into submission. That hasn't happened. Why? Because some of our, and I use the term loosely, some of our other allies who rely on Russian energy are continuing to flow money in there, and that's a problem. So, kind of why everybody thinks that the U.S. should take the lead. It's looking very Cold War-ish right now. But the reality is that I think if the EU and the member states of the EU were to hold tight, seek sourcing from energy from other resources, other areas, I think as long as they are buying oil from Russia,
it's just easier to choke them out, basically. That's the strategy.
Correct. Correct.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Justin Thomas Russell, the Global Foreign Policy Centre Executive Director. Thank you for your insights and thank you for joining me here on In Focus. This was In Focus. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.